Well, joining me now in Madrid is Luis Arroyo. He was the political advisor to Spain's former socialist prime minister Zapatero. He's now an advisor to the socialist group in the European Parliament. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, is philosopher and Harvard law professor Roberto Mangabeira Unger. He was also a minister in the socialist government of Brazil's Workers' Party. And in Fellina Valdarno, Italy, is Professor Guy Standing. He's the author of The Corruption of Capitalism and a founding member of the Basic Income Earth Network. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us. Guy Standing, let me start with you. As we look ahead towards those European elections, has the left been to blame for its failings because it's not expected to do well?
I think the failings of the left, and particularly the Social Democrats across Europe and globally, derives from their acceptance of the neoliberal paradigm in the 1990s. And the fatal error of opting for so-called third way, which many of the socialist leaders at the time accepted. And that ushered in a policy of accepting the neoliberal economics and addressing poverty as an issue, rather than trying to use the crisis of that time to restructure the economy and have a genuinely socialist strategy. They've been on the defensive ever since. They've been behind the curve in terms of ecology, behind the curve in terms of addressing the growing wealth and income inequalities, and they've been reactionary rather than progressive in offering a narrative for the future.
Okay, Luis Arroyo, was your problem, and when I say your, I'm talking across Europe, so excuse me if I make some generalizations here, but was the problem of the left, especially when the left was in power, was the problem that you were not left-wing enough, and that's why we're seeing a reaction? Either people go right-wing, or you have people like Varoufakis emerging and saying, the left-wing betrayed you, or those who called themselves left-wing betrayed you, you need me.
Well, the issue is that we, as everybody knows, in Europe, we had a huge recession starting 2008. At that precise moment, basically half of the governments in Europe were governed by the socialists. The other half, basically, in broad terms, were governed by the conservatives. The reaction to the crisis was different in every single country, but the perception of the population is that the socialists, in particular, were not up to the crisis challenge. Then we had an enormous migration crisis on 2015 that Europe didn't know how to deal with. That made all these parties from the extreme right rise. But still, we can speak, and that's very precise, that we can speak about a crisis of the socialists, of the social democracy in Europe. But remember that the second group, according to all surveys in Europe, the second group next week is going to be the group of the socialists. Right. So yes, the left is in a crisis, but it's not death at all. It's not death at all.
Right, Roberto Mangabeira Unger, I don't want to make this conversation about Brazil, but given that you're on this panel, I want to ask, there was Lula, and then there was Dilma, and now you have someone like Bolsonaro. Parallels in Europe, where 11 years ago we saw Barack Obama giving a Berlin speech, and I've got quotes from there. Everything was hopeful, and it seemed as if a kind of left-of-center future was the reality for, well, the Americans, the Europeans, and everybody else, right? And we're seeing a backlash now. We're seeing Le Pen, and we're seeing Salvini and all of them so galvanized. Is what happened in Brazil happening in Europe?
There is a common element in all these situations. And the common element is the absence of a structural program that can deal with the problems of stagnation and inequality. The left and the center-left parties appear on the stage of contemporary history as the humanizers of the inevitable. And rather than having a project of their own, they seek to put a human face on the project of their conservative adversaries. That's a losing position in politics, and it's created a vacuum into which right-wing populism has entered.
Interesting point. Let me ask guy standing the symbolism of seeing Salvini and Le Pen and Wilders all standing together at Piazza del Duomo in Milan saying, we are going to change history and we're going to change Europe. Tell me how important that is.
I'm afraid I predicted in a book in 2011 that unless the insecurities and aspirations of the growing precariat were addressed by the left, we would see the emergence of a political monster. That was the exact term I used. And in 2016, a lot of readers wrote to me saying, your monster has arrived. Of course, that was Trump. Now we have lookalikes across Europe and in Brazil and elsewhere who are aping a Trump. They're offering the same sort of disgusting language, homophobia, xenophobia, racism, misogyny. It's all part of a package of proto-fascist agendas. And many of these people look back with fondness to people like Hitler and Mussolini, and there's no doubt about it when they think that they're going to be offering a strong leader that breaks the rules and breaks the mold, just as Trump is projecting himself. So I think we are seeing the outcome of this loss of a narrative from the left, and I totally agree with the previous two speakers. The narrative which is offering a good society from a socialist and a progressive side, that absence in the last 20 years has been a failing that we on the left must accept. And we must now demand that the young people emerging in the progressive side of politics articulate an agenda that is ecological, that is redistributive, restructuring, and transformative. And I think we are at a crisis point. You know, the famous saying that the darkest point of a tunnel is just before you come out. I think we are seeing a precariat movement beginning with the Extinction Rebellion and with various other precariat movements around Europe. But at the moment, it's a pretty dark moment.
Luis Arroyo, in your country, the rise of Vox, is that an accurate representation of everything we've heard over the past few minutes, of the gap that was there?
Absolutely.
Maybe because of the fault of the left,
yeah.
and therefore people turn right-wing?
Absolutely, it's the same. Vox is the brother party of the extreme right in Europe. There's no doubt. The agenda is exactly the same: anti-migration, basically anti-Europe. You cannot be very anti-European here in Spain, but they are very critical with the European Union. The reference to the nation all the time, the reference to the history, mythical history of a united Spain, etc. So it's basically the same. I agree with my colleagues in the sense that this is basically historically, anthropologically, it's the same thing everywhere. It doesn't matter if it's in Latin America, like Bolsonaro, in Italy, Salvini, in the US, no doubt, Donald Trump. It doesn't matter. It's exactly the same narrative. After a crisis, populism rises. The hate against the other arises, and that's contrary to the principles and the fundamentals of the Social Democrats, obviously.
Roberto, Unger, what is wrong with the left?
What's wrong with it is that it doesn't have a structural program. And the structural program has to have the following elements. First, it has to reshape the market economy. We have a new advanced practice of production, which we call the knowledge economy. It exists only in the form of an insular vanguard that excludes the vast majority of firms and of workers. And we need to replace this insular vanguardism by an inclusive vanguardism. The insular vanguardism is accompanied by the consignment of an increasing part of the labor force to precarious employment and radical economic insecurity. We need a new labor law regime to master this new economic reality. And it is accompanied as well by the detachment of finance from the productive agenda of society. Finance can be a good servant, but it is invariably a bad master. So we need to reshape the relation of finance to the real economy. The second great axis of this program, alongside the economic one, is to provide a basis for social cohesion. Mm-hmm. Money transfers organized by the state against the background of ethnic and cultural homogeneity are not a sufficient social cement. The only adequate basis for social cohesion is the multiplication of forms of collective action, which would be the other great focus of the left parties. And the third element is the creation of a high-energy democracy that does not need crisis as the enabling circumstance of change. The European peoples in the 20th century awoke when they were at war, and then in peace they fell asleep and drowned their sorrows in consumption. They have not yet learned how to be both at peace and awake. For that, we need a different kind of politics that heightens the level of popular engagement in political life, that resolves impasse quickly, hastening the pace of politics, and that combines decisive action by central governments with radical experimentalist devolution. All of the elements of such a structural alternative are missing from the discourse of the contemporary left.
Guy standing, for many voters in Europe, whether national elections or EU elections, it's about migration, migration, migration. Does the left need better arguments for people when they have worries about migration than to just call them racists? If somebody says, I don't know what's going on with these refugees, and you say, oh, you're a racist, and then they fall into the laps of the far right. Does the left need to have better arguments?
Yeah, I think with the causes of the anti-migration sentiment, if you like, needs to be addressed by the left. We have a chronic problem of inequality. We have a chronic problem of economic insecurity for the precariat and millions around Europe. We have huge private debt. We have huge stress. And all of these things produce a sense of precarity. And that breeds the sort of sentiment that is now existing. I agree with you entirely. We should not focus on calling people racists and things. We should focus on the fears that are inducing people to think that the stranger or the other is the real source of their predicament. We must address their predicaments. And that fundamentally means we have to provide sources of security, which is one of the main reasons I support a basic income. Basic income will not cure all our ills, but it will offer a future where people have a sense of basic security. And without that, we're going to see a continual growth of this far-right populism.
Luis Arroyo, very finally, what's your message to those who would say that the left wing is done, it's dead, it's over, it's gone?
No, absolutely, absolutely. We have a new government in Spain that has just been elected just a couple of weeks ago. The socialists are doing well in some other countries in Europe. They are governing in Portugal. They are starting to recover in many other countries, in many other nations in Europe. They're going to be the second group for sure, at least the second group. The first are going to be basically the conservatives. There's, of course, a challenge of having a third or a fourth group in the European Parliament that is going to be directly anti-Europe. But no, social democracy is alive. It has new challenges, no doubt. The old society, the old industrial society in which workers could meet and work together in the defense of their interests, etc., that's gone. We have a new society with new challenges that the social democracy has to adopt and has to take. But I wouldn't say at all that the social democracy is dead. No, not at all.
Luis Arroyo, Guy Standing, and Roberto Mangabeira Unger, it's been great talking to all of you. Thank you very much.